Welcome to everyone. I know we have some people from all corners of the globe on here with us right now. We're looking forward to a great chat and a good conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Julie Bates, and I'm the Donor Relations Manager for IEF. And our other staff members on the line with us today include Deborah Olson, our Executive Director, and Sarah Conley, our Director of Conservation. So before we dive in, I just want to go into a couple of housekeeping notes. As we go through the chat today, if you could please keep your microphones and cameras off, that would be great. It will help us save on bandwidth. Also, just to let you know, we will be recording this chat, and the conversation will probably last about 30 minutes for the presentation, and then after that, we'll open it up for questions to everybody. So we just look forward to a great chat. And I think that covers everything. So I'll turn it over to Sarah now, and she's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. IEF is pleased to welcome Helene Barnes today for our conservation chat. Helene grew up in the UK and received a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a master's in protected landscape management, which included 3 months of data collection in Zambia. It was there that she had her first encounters with wild elephants that she may tell us about, but she then moved to Vietnam to coordinate Fauna and Flora International's Asia Pacific program, which included supporting their Sumatran elephant focused projects in northern Sumatra and Aceh, where she first encountered elephants at the Tangkahan Conflict Response Unit. Helene then moved to Aceh in 2024 after the Indian Ocean Tsunami to help coordinate emergency response and then to manage community-based conservation initiatives across 5 districts of West Aceh. She also got married to an Acehnese man, establishing a small holding and becoming immersed in rural Acehnese life. In 2010, she and several colleagues established a new local NGO to focus on providing small-scale support to empower communities to protect and manage their local natural resources. Over the last 15 years, they have supported forest edge and coastal communities to understand their local wildlife and wild places and find sustainable solutions to the challenges they face. We are really happy to have her here with us, especially because she's coming directly from Sumatra, where it is 6 a.m. So she had to get up bright and early to talk to all of us. Hi, Helene. Thank you for being here.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
All right. So I'm going to turn it over to you if you want to screen share and we can learn all about the great work you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, hopefully that's worked. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk to you. As Sarah said, yeah, my first encounter with elephants, it was in Africa, in Zambia, and where I was living was right next, just outside a national park, just outside the South Luangwa National Park, and there seemed to be a almost resident group of elephants which lived in an area just between where I was living and where I was doing my data collection. And so it was a bit like a gauntlet that you had to run. And if you were lucky, there was a truck going past that you could jump on to get past along the road where they were. But the advice I was given by local women was, oh, well, if the elephants are there when you're going past, just pull up your shirt because they won't notice you. And then they said, oh no, you're white, so if you pull up your shirt you'll still be white and the elephants will still see you. So that was my first encounter with elephants, but my more recent encounters are in with Sumatran elephants in Aceh. So today I thought I'd give a bit of an introduction to the organization that I established, Rincong, about Aceh and about elephants in Aceh. And then mostly I'll talk about the work that we've been doing with communities in Aceh to conserve elephants. And then a very brief bit about what we're kind of thinking of doing in the future. And then hopefully we'll have some interesting questions to talk about. So first of all, introduction to Rincong. It's called Perkumpulan Rincong. Perkumpulan just means association in Indonesian. And Rincong is a traditional sword in Aceh that was used, in history, and it's quite a popular sort of object of historical significance, and so we're called Rincong. Like Sarah said, we were established in 2010. We'd worked for Fauna and Flora International in Aceh as the Aceh program. I've been running a community conservation team with FFI in Aceh, and then as the program kind of changed a bit, we then decided to establish a local NGO as a more sort of sustainable way of operating rather than being a big international NGO in the country. And we wanted to focus on supporting communities to identify for themselves what they needed to do and what they wanted to do in terms of conservation of their natural resources, and then to try to facilitate them to achieve those objectives, either working in partnership with governments or sourcing funding or providing them with technical support, whatever they needed. Our focus in terms of communities is an institution called a mukim, and mukims are a group of villages. So there might be maybe 3 to 7 villages will form a mukim, and that is a very old customary group, a community group. And that's the focus we've been working with, because they have customary rights to manage their local natural resources. And generally, we operate securing grants from international donors, varying between $15,000 to about maximum $60,000. So we're relatively small, but we like it like that because that means we're working kind of at the field level, and we're still connected with the communities, and we don't have a lot of administration and overheads to try and find funding for. These are some pictures of the team, some of the members of the team. We only have a small number of people who work, sort of with us all the time. A whistle-stop tour of Aceh. I put in a map of where we are. It's located northwest end of Sumatra. And in sort of Southeast Asia, closer to Kuala Lumpur than Jakarta, which is the capital of Indonesia. And Aceh is dominated by the mountain range that runs all the way along the spine of Sumatra, the Bukit Barisan mountain range, which is volcanic. And that means that then Aceh has a lot of rich resources, both inland in terms of minerals, gold, and also offshore there's oil, which I'll mention later is important in the history of Aceh. It's also rich in marine resources, having a large coastline, and so a lot of the livelihoods with it's not farming, it's people are fishermen. Why can't I? Can't. Why doesn't it want to? Oh, okay. Okay. Bit of history on Aceh. Aceh is traditionally historically known as Serambi Makkah, which means the terrace of Mecca, recognizing that Aceh was the sort of the point in Indonesia where Islam came into the country, and now Indonesia's the highest populated Islamic country. And in the past, it was a sultanate. It had a sultan, well, many sultans. One of the most important sultans was Sultan Iskandar Muda, which translates as young Alexander, as opposed to Alexander the Great. This is young Alexander. And he was ruling in the 1600s. And at that time, Aceh had a huge dominance over large parts of Malaysia, Thailand, and what is now Singapore, maintaining the trade routes to China, particularly of black pepper, which was grown in Aceh and also Malaysia, then controlled by Aceh. So black pepper was the main trade spice in those times. And by the 1800s, Aceh was supplying half of the world's black pepper. So in the past, it was a major force in trade, and also important in terms of colonization. These two people, this is Tunku Umar and Chutnyak Dien, his wife, and they were famous in Aceh for fighting to try to maintain independence of Aceh when the Dutch came and invaded, because they wanted to control the black pepper trade. And this history of struggle for independence has continued throughout Aceh's history. And this is Dal Brue, who continued the fight after Indonesia became independent, after the war and invasion by the Japanese. He tried to negotiate with the then Jakarta government to have independence of Aceh, particularly to be able to implement Islamic law, but also, more importantly, to have control over the income from the natural resources, particularly the offshore oil. This has continued, and more recently in sort of living history, it continued with a ongoing fight, 30 years of guerrilla warfare between the Aceh Freedom Movement and the Indonesian government and the Indonesian military. And this is Muhammad Tiro, Hassan Ditiro, and he led the fight for 30 years, apparently a descendant of the last Sultan of Aceh. And he declared independence in 1975, but the conflict continued from them until the tsunami that happened in end of 2004. And one of the more happy outcomes of the tsunami was that it actually stimulated negotiations and peace. After sort of 6 months after the tsunami, peace was agreed between the Indonesian government and the Aceh Freedom Movement, which was incredibly important for distribution of aid, because for 6 months we were operating still theoretically in a conflict, and there wasn't peace, and there was the threat, and there was some cases of gun warfare in the first 6 months after the tsunami. So having peace was incredibly important for distributing aid and for communities to recover. And largely, that peace has continued. And the first governor was locally elected, was Irwandi Yusuf, who was one of the negotiators for the Freedom Aceh movement. He was elected in the elections in 2006. And following that, peace has been largely maintained, and the Freedom Aceh movement formed a local political party which continues to take part in elections. So compared to some of the other conflicts around the world, this has been a relatively successful peace process. So that's a bit of history of Aceh. Currently, Aceh is dominated by farmers and traders, and around the coast, fishermen. Everywhere that rice can be grown is grown either irrigated or rain-fed. People then on land that they can't grow rice on will grow annual crops like peanuts, corn, chilies, cucumbers, other things like papaya, bananas. And then in the more upland land, they'll have agroforestry crops, which could include cocoa, coffee, rubber, oil palm and durian. And it's usually, apart from oil palm, it's usually a mixture that people will grow. And then, of course, around the coast, fishing using nets, hook and line, and also quite a lot of prawn aquaculture. And then those who live in the towns are often trading all the agriculture exports from Aceh. There's some pictures of the coffee, durian and tilapia fish. In terms of wildlife and biodiversity, Aceh is incredibly important. It's got the largest contiguous forest in Southeast Asia. 3.3 million hectares, and it still has a lot of very endangered species, including Sumatran elephant, Sumatran orangutan, and Sumatran tiger. So it's been a sort of refuge for wildlife, and including there's an endemic species of leaf monkey, Thomasy leaf monkey. Apart from the wildlife, it's incredibly important for all the communities. Generally, the forest is basically in the middle, in the uplands, and then the communities mostly live around the edge of it and in the lowlands. And so it's incredibly important as a source of water, for fertility for all the farmland, and protecting from flooding, because we're tropical. And so if you don't have trees covering the land, then water just runs over the surface and causes flooding. And for the world, it's a carbon sink. For elephants, it's also incredibly important. We don't know the exact population of elephants in Aceh, but around 500, 540, something like that. As everyone knows, the Sumatran elephant is critically endangered, and it continues to be threatened by human-elephant conflict. And the human-elephant conflict, ultimately, then the reason why it affects sort of the population of elephants is that it generally results in poaching as a sort of justification for poaching, or directly people poisoning the elephants. One of the main threats and one of the main causes of this increased human-elephant conflict is the expansion of oil palm, and that's been really drastic. Previously, you never saw oil palm in Aceh, and then it's become habituous, and between 1990 and 2010, West Aceh, which is sort of a quarter of Aceh, I'd say, lost 26% of its primary forest. More recent threats have become, apart from the oil palm, well, timber extraction has been a cause of disturbance of the habitat for quite a long time, but more recently has been extraction of gold. It used to be extracted by people panning in rivers, but now it's become people excavating, illegal excavation, using excavators, and just completely destroying the forest to get to the gold underneath the forest. So with that background, hopefully it will make sense why I've sort of explained in detail about the background. And I'll explain our work with communities in Aceh. So another map. This is the northwest end of Aceh. So we focus in this sort of area, about 5 districts in this area. And in 2019, we'd been working in sort of central Aceh from 2010 when we first began working. But then in 2019, we went back where we had been working for FFI in Aceh Barat, which means West Aceh, but it's where I've marked there with an arrow. That's the district of West Aceh. And we started working particularly focusing on elephants. We'd previously been working there more generally to do with forests, but we focused on human-elephant conflict in 2019. And then having started work there the following year, we then went to Aceh Jaya, which is the neighbouring district up the coast, in 2020. And Aceh Jaya we have a very close connection with, because Aceh Jaya is the area that was most affected by the tsunami. That's the center of the earthquake, and then the tsunami was off the coast of Aceh Jaya, and the tsunami reached the coast within 20 minutes of the earthquake, and that was where the greatest devastation was. And that's where, when we were working for FFI, that's where we focused our support, because we'd previously been working with communities also on elephant conservation. And so we spent a large amount of the first 6 months of 2005, we focused on distributing aid. So we have a very close relationship with the people, with the communities in that area. So we wanted to get back to Aceh Jaya. And so we then expanded our work human elephant conflict in those 2 villages in Aceh Jaya. And then in 2024, we started working with 2 neighbouring villages in Aceh Jaya, again, expanding the work. The work we were doing is, I'll explain the process, but overall, it's really working with the communities, participatory with them, and we help them, and together we learn about what the root causes of the human-elephant conflict are in their specific location, and then together to develop a strategy to address those root causes, and then try and implement the actions, the priority actions from those strategies. And that's what I'll explain in detail for the communities in Aceh Jaya that we've been working with. So first of all, the first stage is to develop a community strategy. And we use some participatory tools just to start the discussion, to start understanding the history and the current situation of human-elephant conflict in the local area. So we do a historical and seasonal timeline of human-elephant conflict. And we discuss what's happened and try and identify the factors that have caused that or are influencing what's happening, what's happened in the past, and why human-elephant conflict has increased. And then from that, we try and identify, well, what are the root causes? What is causing those factors? And then agree what are the feasible strategies that we could implement to address those. We then do an assessment of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of the community's ability to tackle those root causes and undertake those strategies. And then they develop an action plan. And one of the first points of the action plan is then to create a village human-elephant conflict management team who are then responsible for implementing the action plan. So that's generally the sort of process that we've done in the communities. This is an example of one of the communities. I just took one of them, of the historic timeline that we produced. It's very much redacted and reduced to fit on one page, and to produce this would be a sort of a day of discussion, but I've kind of reduced it just so that I can sort of show the sort of things we discuss and how that enables us to identify what are the problems and what strategies we can come up with. So this is Panga, the name of the community that we're working with, Panga. So we divide the timeline to before 2000 and then between 2000 and 2005. Everybody knows 2005 as a timestamp because that's the tsunami, and people often still divide life between before the tsunami and after the tsunami. So that's a good time to sort of divide up. The reason why I had before 2000 was because the level of conflict before 2000 was relatively safer. It wasn't completely safe, but the communities were safer. And between 2000 and 2005, the conflict became really intense and dangerous, and farmers couldn't go to their farmland. So we talked about sort of before the conflict became really bad, and then when the conflict was particularly bad, and then after the tsunami when peace came, and then the more recent between 2020 and now of the sort of more recent history. So as you'd expect, it's gone from the condition of the forest, started off being largely undisturbed, and it was largely undisturbed, and that's why it's become been a refuge for wildlife, because of the conflict. So the conflict meant that you had the Indonesian army and the local Aceh freedom movement were fighting with firearms, and so it was the Indonesian army or the Aceh freedom movement would tell communities, you can't go to your farms because we don't want people, in the area that we don't know who you are. And so for large spans of time, they couldn't go to their farms. They couldn't harvest their rubber, their durian. They couldn't plant peanuts or chilies. At most, they could go to their rice fields because their rice fields are near the village. But on occasions, communities couldn't even harvest their rice because they'd been told they had to evacuate and they had to abandon their village and move away from that area. So the forest benefited and it was largely undisturbed. And then it remained largely undisturbed during the conflict between 2000 and 2005. And then 2005 came, the tsunami came, and the peace came, a huge demand for wood to rebuild houses, and peace so that people could go to the forest, but there still were a lot of military personnel around, and so logging became probably the biggest threat at that time. Farmland encroachment was relatively small initially. By 2020, farmland encroachment, small-scale farms, was becoming a problem because people had used the land that they'd had near their rice fields, and they wanted to expand. And then, of course, after 2020, it's become worse, and with the addition of gold mining becoming a big factor in terms of disturbance of the forest and the impact of that, I'll talk about in a minute. As you can see, of course, then the area of farmland has extended from 5 hectares around the village to, over 100 hectares of farmland. Their crops changed slightly, particularly from 2005, the addition of oil palm, which we all know is the favourite of elephants, and they will love if you plant some oil palm. They'll come and treat it like a restaurant. And so then the number of cases of elephants being seen in sort of farmland nearer the village increased, starting off being, they had sightings of elephants, but it wasn't generally a problem. It was infrequent, and also it was predictable. There was a predictable annual cycle of when the elephants would be coming past, and people would plant their crops according to that. So their chilies and their peanuts, they knew when the elephants would be coming that year, and so they would plant so they could plant and harvest before the elephants came back again, because they sort of go up and down the west coast. But then as disturbance of the forest became worse, then the cycle has been disturbed. It's like a weather pattern. It's been disturbed, and it's not predictable now, and it's more frequent, and the numbers that are seen have increased. The area of land then that's been disturbed by the elephants has increased to a manageable under 1 hectare to I think 30 hectares was probably 2002, I think, was the example they had, 30 hectares in a year. And then the tools that they've used to try and warn off elephants has changed. They used to use buffalo horns that they'd use like a trumpet, or they'd have fires around their agricultural land. And then they started using firecrackers and then bamboo cannons that they've used. And they've become ineffective for warning off the elephants. So that's a very brief summary of the sort of discussion we have about what's the situation. And based on that, we then try and identify what are the factors that are sort of affecting the amount and level of disturbance of human-elephant conflict. And so, in summary, on the left-hand side, they identified 4 main factors, one being the encroachment and disturbance of elephant habitat. And these are 2 different things. One is encroachment of the farmland, so that's reducing the area of forest, and also meaning that there's farmland on what was elephant habitat. Disturbance is where you've got logging or gold mining, and often it will disturb the elephants to such a point that they then either take different routes, and so that you then have them coming in different directions from the farmland to what the traditional route was, or again the timing that they don't follow the normal route that they would have, because now there's a gold mine plonked in the middle of the route that they used to take, and so they are disturbed, and then the patterns are disturbed. The second factor is that the agriculture the expanding agriculture, it's not just a blanket expansion, it's a mosaic. And so you have plots of 1 hectare, which some are being used, planted with various different crops, some that are surrounded by bits that aren't being used. So it's not a very effective use of the land, which also then means that you have expansion into the forest. But then you have sort of a mixture. You have oil palm, and then you've got something else, like you've got peanuts or something. And so if you've got some oil palm interspersed in other crops, then that's attractive to the elephants, and they'll come down and then, you know, go to other plots of land. The third one is that particularly in that village, the road, there used to be a track that people would use to get up to their further upland farmland, and that's now become a tarmac road, and that has become a route for elephants to use. And so plus other sort of tracks coming off of that they use, so that it's become easier for the elephants to come into the farmland, whereas previously there might have been impenetrable parts of a forest that they wouldn't come through, or there'd be a valley which they wouldn't cross. There's become more routes for the elephants to come onto the farmland. And then the fourth one was that their guarding and warning tools were either inconsistent or had become ineffective. So based on those four factors, we then discussed the strategies that they could try to implement to reduce, prevent and mitigate human-elephant conflict. So the first one was to protect the boundary of the current forest from further agricultural expansion. They understand that, you know, the more they expand into the forest, the more they're inviting elephants and causing elephants to come onto farmland, and that any farmland that's produced, that's created on current forest that's being used by the elephants is bound to become attractive to elephants, and it's going to be quite difficult to grow crops. The second one is consolidating the agricultural land. So to try to change it from a mosaic of plots that are used or not used, and that's all because farmland is handed down from, you know, father to son or mother to daughter, usually father to son. And then you'll have a plot that somebody, oh, I don't want to use that plot, but it's just abandoned, then it's not used. And so somebody who needs a new plot of land, they can't use that plot of land, it's rarely sold, they'll just go and open up a new bit of land. So to have some system for consolidating the agricultural land and stopping people using palatable crops, at least near in the sort of boundary with the forest. Thirdly, to reduce the access routes for the elephants onto the farmland. And fourthly, to try and plan and implement a more organised, coordinated monitoring and guarding system. So those were their strategies. So the first action from that was to do some land use planning, which had multiple uses for in terms of protecting the border with the forest, and also consolidating the land use and working out where the routes were that needed to be protected, so that the elephants couldn't come down, have easy routes down into the farmland. So we did some participatory planning. First of all, we do a sketch map with the community of what land there is, what it's used for, whether it's actively managed, who has it, what crops are grown there, and then where is the elephant conflict happening, where are elephants being seen, how many, and what are the routes. So you can see at the top there's an arrow there, that's one of the routes. There's another one here, the route that the elephants use to get onto the farmland. So we do a sketch map with them, and then go out into the field, and the points from that sketch map we geolocate using GPS, and so that we can then plot it onto a GIS map. And then based on that, they then agreed what their land use plan would be like. They created zones. They created a zonation plan of a protected area, which was the border with the forest, where they wouldn't open up farmland. They wanted to maintain their claim to the land, that is within the village boundaries, but that they wouldn't use it for farmland. And then they have a buffer zone of agricultural land, which is current agricultural land, but you could only plant crops that are known to not be palatable to elephants, or at least less palatable to elephants. And so that would create a boundary, and certainly not oil palm. And then a agricultural zone, which is sort of between there and the village and the rice fields, where you could grow whatever crops you wanted to grow. So they came up with this village regulation, created a village regulation about how people could use the farmland based on the mapping that they'd done and the agreement they'd made of the zonation. And then they communicated that to everybody, put up posters, did village meetings to explain, and it's an ongoing process of communicating to the community and getting people to understand why it's important, what's the purpose of it, and what it means for people in terms of planting. And then also a process of changing the land use. So if people are already planting a crop that's palatable to elephants and it's in the buffer zone, then there needs to be a process of convincing them they need to change their crops. And usually the elephants help, and they'll come along and eat all the oil palm saplings. And then when they want to replant, then there's a time to convince them to plant something else. The next thing that they've been doing is dealing with the access routes. And one of the options for trying to reduce the ease of access for elephants is establishing electric fences. And that's been done in the previous communities that we'd worked in Aceh Jaya. They had managed to get the government to establish two short stretches of fencing across specific routes which were used by elephants. But these are short term, they'll require maintenance and repair, and it's inevitable that they will end up being unusable or ineffective. And so we wanted to come up with a solution that would be more long term. And so we agreed that we would also, behind the electric fence, plant thorny trees. And these are a local native tree. It's like a sort of a native lemon, so it's got thorns, really big thorns, and the fruit aren't massive big lemons. And so they would be planted behind the electric fence. So the electric fence would provide protection to them while they grow. And then once they're big and have created a barrier, then when the electric fence inevitably falls into disrepair and stops working, then there will be another barrier. So that was the next priority for them. And then thirdly, responding to elephant encroachment onto the agricultural land. So after they'd done all the planning, they created a village human elephant conflict management team made up of 5 people who would coordinate all the implementation of the activities and also monitoring the elephants and responding to conflict. And we gave training in terms of tactics for monitoring, because their monitoring was sort of piecemeal, and we sort of gave training in terms of it needs to be consistent and regular, and that you need to, when the elephants are around, you need to be consistent in terms of guarding land. And then a very important aspect was facilitating them to coordinate with the government, because the government have a department responsible for wildlife. They have people who are regularly responding to human elephant conflict. And so, as is the case in many communities, there wasn't much communication or coordination between the community and the government. They would, just sort of turn up if there was conflict, but there wasn't any coordination prior to any conflict to try and coordinate guarding or patrolling. And so we facilitated that relationship. And then we provided them training and the means to record and monitor the incidents, so they would be able to see patterns and be able to see what responses were effective and whether the conflict is changing. So this is a picture of the village management team, or a member of the village management team, receiving his letter of appointment. And then this is one of the teams responding. This is actually a picture from a video, which is in one of our videos of there's elephants just in the background there. So future plans, our future plans. I've limited this to mostly to the particular communities we've been working with. So the priority now, the village management teams, they have these work plans that they've prepared, and that they want what they want to implement on a regular basis, and some particular activities, and that is one of our priorities. So we need to build their capacity to be able to communicate and work with communities so that they do comply with the regulation. We need to particularly build their confidence in in explaining the reasons for why they need to manage the land use, and then talking with farmers, and then eventually, you know, if there's people who aren't following the regulation, building their capacity so that they're able to enforce it. Secondly, again, improve the community's wider understanding of human-elephant conflict, so sort of transferring what they've learned during the process to the wider community, so they really are bought into understanding the purpose, and really importantly, understanding that oil palm is not profitable in those areas, because people will just over and over again replant oil palm and think that when it, you know, when they get fruits from it, they're going to be rich, but they never actually end up with a plantation of oil palm that are fruiting, because the elephants will just come and eat them, eat the small plants. So building building the community's understanding of the crops that they can plant, and including giving, you know, demonstrations of crops that are profitable and are not trampled by the elephants. And then thirdly, to support them to do regular monitoring of the elephant movements, and then taking action to respond when the elephants head towards the agricultural land. So that's our priorities for those communities. And then finally, our priorities more broadly, we want to scale up what we've been doing. We've now done the sort of same process in 6 communities. So we have kind of a good idea of what's a most efficient, effective process, what works with communities, what they're able to understand, and what they're able to, what the process is that helps them to come up with a strategy. And so we're working with the government, who are responsible for wildlife, to replicate both establishing the village management teams, which is a policy of the government, and then facilitating them to not just be a team, but to have a strategy based on the local situation. To do that, we are producing a step-by-step manual. We've done a video of it, and we're doing a written manual, so that to make it easy to be replicated, and to be at a level that means that communities can implement it on their own. And then thirdly, as I mentioned, trialing alternative crops that are profitable, that we can reach an added value market, but that are not palatable to elephants. So that's our priority. Some pictures. These are QR codes to a couple of videos that we've produced. And that brings me to the end. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's been listening. I'd particularly like to say thank you to Sarah for all your support, and to the International Elephant Foundation for support of our work in Panga. And hopefully we can continue to support the communities in Panga and in Aceh to try and tackle the ongoing problem of human-elephant conflict. And I'm really looking forward to hearing people's questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. So informative. We have a lot of questions coming in. First of all, this is an excellent program. Is it being utilized in any other areas, any other regions that you know?
Our specific method, as far as I know, not yet. But I think because we're at the stage now where we've developed the process, we've trialed it, and we're at the stage where we can say, okay, we think this process works. I think that will be the next phase, that we can, as I said, work with the government, because if you integrate it into the government, then it becomes much more readily replicated, because they can advocate for it, and they can say, we want you to use this process, this, you know, this system. So we're only just really now, I think, having done these second 2 communities in Panga, we now kind of know what's the most efficient process to be able to come up with strategies. And so I think that's the next phase, is to get it much more sort of integrated into the government, and then able to be replicated more broadly.
Excellent. Yeah. So the next step is getting government support in some way. How do you start doing that?
We've already got government support. We're already working with them. They know what the process that we've been doing. Like I said, they already have a policy for these human elephant management teams, and that starts at the provincial level. So they have a provincial level human management. I don't think it's called team. It's, you know, sort of unit. And so that's multi-stakeholders. So that brings in different stakeholders. And then the idea is that it then goes down to district level, and you have a unit that's specifically multi-stakeholder unit focused on human elephant management, and then the village level, and their policy is to have these village level management teams, but they haven't. I think ours are the first ones where we've actually implemented village level human elephant management teams. So it's kind of a demonstration of having the team, but it's important not to just have the team, but to actually help them to have a plan and to know what they're doing, and not just be a team doing the standard, oh, there's an elephant, oh, let's call the government and try and push the elephants back. It's much more about preparing for it and trying to prevent it before it actually happens. And so this is the first time that we've got an actual demonstration. So the government are completely supportive, and we regularly coordinate with them. So now it's just a process of how do we make it so that it becomes the standard for them for communities when they know of areas where there's human elephant conflict, that it becomes the standard for them to use. And then also providing the support and the funding to enable that, because it's going to need funding to, even if it's small levels, to have people who are trained in facilitation to be able to facilitate communities to undertake the work. So there's that aspect as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned funding. I know IEF has provided funding, but is there additional work that you want to do? How do you fund these initiatives?
Yeah, so IEF supported the most recent work that we did in those second two villages. And other organizations that we hope will be able to use our process, they secure funding as well. The government has funding as well. It's just the process of getting government funding is very lengthy. The budgeting process is, you know, it's kind of 2 years really. If you want to get something into the budget for now we're talking about that they're discussing budgets for 2006, but you'd have to already have it as a plan. So you're more realistically, if you're talking about it now, it might get into the budget for 2007, but the budget is also very limited in terms of scope of what it can fund and what it can't fund. So there are some things that it can fund, and then we seek additional external donor support for the aspects which they can't fund, or that it just isn't responsive enough to be able to respond to immediate needs. Government funding is very slow and sluggish, and having donor funding means you can be very responsive. So you can sort of say, well, we'll develop a strategy and then we'll implement certain aspects of it. And you don't know what those aspects are going to be until you develop the strategy. But if you've got flexible donor funding, you can just say, well, when we know what the strategy is, then we'll support, parts of it. It's much more flexible, whereas government funding, it's very slow.
Absolutely. So a partnership with the private donors and the grants, definitely.
Yep.
So someone is asking about the thorny shrubs. Are there any native species or animals that those thorny shrubs are vulnerable to?
As far as I know, no. Yeah, these the particular ones. Often you plant just lemon trees, and they're a type of lemon. They're sort of like a native lemon, so they're bigger thorns and smaller fruits. And so that's why we chose them, because they collected the seeds locally from sort of the forest edge. They collected the seeds and grew them up to then plant out. That's why we chose them, because they're native, they're suitable for the conditions, but we just wanted to plant them so that they became more of a barrier rather than just into odd plants. So I don't know that they are vulnerable. I mean, they're bound to have some pests and diseases, but nothing. And certainly the elephants don't like them. There's quite a lot of species of other things. Another thing, there's a thing called dragon's blood, which is it's like a rattan, and it has massive spikes on, and it will grow into a big sort of thicket. It just rambles everywhere. And we've tried that in Aceh Barat. We did that. We planted because there was a naturally growing thicket of it, and it was known that the elephants just don't come that way because there's this thicket of this rambling thorny rattan, and so we planted more of it. And it's actually highly prized because it has a fruit which is it has a resin which is used as a dye, and it's used as a Chinese medicine. The dye that's used to make violin varnish kind of red is that, and so it's quite valuable. And that can be grown. It's just that takes a lot longer to grow. Once it's a thicket, it's really good, but it takes a long time to plant, to get growing seedlings, and then to plant out and to become a good thicket.
Wow, that's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the community. So how do the farmers, I mean, their entire livelihoods could be threatened by these elephants. So how do they view the elephants?
Up until now, I would say probably about 70% of the farmers, I would say, they tolerate them, and they understand them as being, elephants are quite respected. They have a very significant historical value in Aceh, and they're respected as being wildlife that exist in Aceh, and they have a right to exist, and they have to be sort of tolerated. And it's just a problem that they come and eat the crops. Maybe 30 or 20 or 30% of people might be more kind of, well, I'd rather they just didn't exist. And there'll be the people who are willing to go in and poison the elephants or poach them. But I'd say the majority of people, they're just a risk of farming. The problem is that the attraction of oil palm is too great, and they're just blind to the fact that elephants are just going to come and eat the oil palm seedlings. And they see the oil palm plantations, big oil palm plantations that have the funds to have guards and with guns who can protect the oil palms. They see them and think, oh, that oil palm is a lucrative business, but not for small scale farmers. So they still go for the oil palm. That's why we're really trying to show, by doing demonstration plots of alternative crops which don't get trampled. And I think by showing it visibly that elephants don't come and trample the coffee plantation, then hopefully then the farmers will see that the coffee or cocoa is an alternative and that they can plant it. But generally they are surprisingly tolerant of elephants.
Well, that's good to hear, and also a really great approach. So have you found that your approach, incorporating the community and all of that listening and research, is that more beneficial than some of the other approaches that you've seen conservation wise? I know you've worked in the space for a long time.
Yes, I mean, it's a much more lengthy and tiring process, but I completely believe in it that for the long term, the people who are doing the farming, the people whose customary land it is, they are the people who are going to be able to, who need to be able to deal with it. And in the long term, they're the people who need to be supported and their capacity built to be able to tackle it. And doing it in a participatory way, bringing them along, certainly takes a lot longer. But definitely turning up and saying, well, what you need to do is this, this, and this, it just won't work. You could pay them to, plant this and plant that, you just throw money at the problem. But once you've gone away, it won't be sustainable. It's like the electric fences is sort of an example. We know that eventually the electric fences, they're not going to be upkept. There's not going to be a budget in the government, budget one year, and they'll fall into disrepair, and we'll be back to square one. That's why we thought, well, planting trees that will create a barrier will provide a long-term solution. And we, based what we were going to plant on the local knowledge of what I never heard of this plant. And they said, oh, well, there's this, thorny tree that we can plant that we can go and get the seeds from, and they won't go through those. So certainly I'm 100% convinced that for the long term of trying to find a solution for human elephant conflict and to protect the elephants eventually, then going through the long process of capacity building and participatory planning is definitely much more sustainable.
Good to know. Yeah. And going along with that, I'm sure educating the community and all of that outreach builds sustainability. So is there any work that's done with the children, with the local schools, anything like that to sort of build it from the ground up?
Yeah. In the last couple of years, we haven't done so much. In the past, we did do quite a lot with schools. We did a program where we would go to, they have in the morning, they have normal school, and then in the afternoon they have religious school. So they go to the local sort of prayer room and have religious school. And we because that's less of the normal school has a national curriculum which you can't touch, and so there's never any space to do much. But the religious school in the afternoon, you can be much more flexible, so we tied it in with that, and we did quite a lot. We've done quite a lot. We've done things with puppet shows, creating dramas, doing education with schools. Unfortunately, the person who was doing that, our education person, hasn't been able to do that for the last few years, but we hope we can in the future, because it's certainly important, and it's a really good way, not just sort of long term, the children will grow up and be the adults, but they take it back home to their parents, and they love having some knowledge that they can tell their parents about, about the elephants and things. And we've done comics. We've created a character called Ranger Zach, and he is in a comic, and we've done various things. We've done 2 comics that we've done on elephant and human elephant conflict, about the reasons why it happens and what people can do to prevent it. So we've done that as a kind of more broad, we give it to the children, they take it home, and then everybody else can read it. And we've done other sort of community awareness activities. So it's certainly really important, and we definitely hope that we can incorporate that again into the whole process of building understanding.
Absolutely, that seems very worthwhile. Questions about oil palms. So do you know how much of Sumatra overall is being planted with sustainable oil palms versus the clear, the habitat destroying plantations?
Yeah. No, I don't know the numbers. I know that sustainable palm oil, RSPO, is becoming more well known, and it is becoming a important factor for the oil palm companies. Interestingly, one of our staff said they met somebody who was from one of the oil palm companies, and they knew about it, and they were talking about it and saying how it's becoming a driver. So the theory in terms of producing a demand for RSPO palm oil is working for some of the companies, because they're sort of saying yes, that's the thing, you can't just do standard planting of oil palm now, you've got to do RSPO. That will be for some companies. I know there are some companies that are still don't care, and they're planting illegally. They establish a they're very tricky. They establish a factory for the oil palm, but they won't have a license for planting oil palm. But what they'll do is they'll engage the community, and they'll basically pay people to open up forest land to plant oil palm, and so it will be under the ownership of the community, but actually it's the oil palm company, and that's how they kind of get around it. But certainly it's becoming more important, and a driver for the big companies. But we're in the area we're talking about, there isn't any oil palm plantations by big companies. It's small communities, and so that it's not on their radar, RSPO, at the moment. So that's the big threat at the moment in West Aceh. It's small individual farmers planting oil palm, and then taking the oil palm to the factory.
Mm.
But down in sort of South Sumatra, I think it's much more large plantations, and it's becoming more important. But I don't know the numbers in terms of RSPO versus standard.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you. All the more reason that your work is so important. And we didn't cover this. Can you say how you got into conservation work in general? Sort of what inspired this life dedicated to wildlife?
Yeah, I think from when I was a child, I was engaged in nature and loved it, and it was just what I was going to do. I knew when I was 13 that I was going to do environmental science as a degree, and then after my degree, I actually got a job to do with sustainable tourism, and I was preparing management plans for tourism destinations for sort of being sustainable. I did that for 2 years, and that was really important, because then I realized actually I wanted to do protected landscape management, and I did my master's. And I've just been really lucky that I sort of have fallen into situations. And then after I did my master's, I then got my job at Fauna and Flora International and started working there. And I was the Asia Pacific manager, living in Vietnam. And one of the projects we had was in Aceh. And I came once and I fell in love with Aceh, and surprisingly, because the conflict was really, really intense then, and I couldn't actually leave the main town, so I never actually saw the forest. But I loved the people and what they were trying to do. And I'd been to, like I said, you mentioned, I'd been to Tangkahan, which is actually in North Sumatra, not in Aceh. But it's a brilliant place. It's on the edge of the Gunung Lusa National Park, and it had trained elephants were doing patrols to try and deal with human-elephant conflict, and that was where I kind of interacted with elephants and the forest. And then and then I ended up met my husband and ended up staying in Aceh, and it's always been my passion.
That's so wonderful. And I think that's a great way to wrap this up. We're coming up on the hour, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but thank you so much. I found it fascinating and incredible. I'm sure everyone else did. Julie, let me turn that over to you.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Helene. What a wonderful presentation. I feel like I learned so much, and the work you're doing is incredible. So I'd like to invite everybody on here to turn on your cameras, and let's give Helene a round of applause for a great presentation.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much.